In the previous lesson, we learned more about Axios by making a request to our mock backend, our JSON server, from our plain JavaScript file. In this lesson, I want to make the same request, but from our React component. And this is where all of the pieces are going to come together, because the place where we're going to make this API request in our component will be in a lifecycle method. More specifically, the componentDidMount lifecycle method, which runs automatically whenever the component is mounted to the DOM. So with that said, let's open up our source directory and the app.js component. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to remove all of my former employee entries from this array. And I'm going to initialize state to be just an empty array of employees. So now you can see all the cards on the right-hand side disappear. Our app is still functional because the employees piece of state is an empty array. And so in our render method, when we filter it, we basically stay with an empty array. And then right here, we map over an empty array. So there's no harm done. We simply generate no JSX here with this map method because our employees array is empty. And this is actually a very common pattern that you're going to see in React code bases. And that is for any piece of data that is going to be provided or populated by an API request, you'll create a property on state to store that eventual data, and you'll start off with an empty representation of that data. So for example, if your backend is giving you an array, then you'll start things off here with an empty array. If your backend will give you an object, for example, representing a user, then you might have a user property here set to an empty object. And the reason you want to start with an empty variation is just to increase the chances that the component renders in all scenarios. It's generally not a good idea to add new properties to state over time. Rather, you want to initialize all of your state properties at once when the component initializes. But if those properties will be filled in later, you want to give them reasonable starting values, such as an empty string for the search term, or an empty array for our eventual collection of employees. Okay, so now what we want to do is make a request to our backend, right? And so we're going to do that in a lifecycle method. And as we mentioned in the first lesson, the way we do that is we define these specific lifecycle methods in line. React will look for methods with these names, so we have to make sure we spell them exactly as they are named. So this one is called componentDidMount. And just like the name suggests, React will run this lifecycle method when the component has mounted, when it is present on the DOM. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is a good spot to make your API request. The reason you don't want to make your API request before the component mounts is if your API request takes time, then the component will not render because it will wait for that API response to complete. So you can see on the right-hand side, even though we don't have any employee cards, we've rendered the rest of the app component. So the user still sees the benefit of the title and the search bar, and they don't just see a blank white screen and think that the app has crashed. So as much as we can load the app for the user, we do want to do that, but then allow that API request to take as much time as necessary. And then when it's done, then we simply save state, which forces a re-render and then renders that new content that we've received. But we don't want to block the loading or mounting of our component because an asynchronous operation such as an API request takes time. So that's why the React development team recommends putting all of that asynchronous logic, the fetching logic, in this lifecycle method componentDidMount. Okay, so at this point, our component will be on the screen, and that's where we make a request. So of course, we're going to need Axios to make the request. So at the very top of the file, I'm going to import Axios from Axios, just like in the last lesson. And we're going to begin with the .then syntax for our promises. I'll show you how to use the async await syntax in the next lesson. But for now, we're going to do the exact same thing we did in the file in the previous lesson. So I'll declare a URL, and that will be our endpoint. So that's going to be HTTP, and then localhost on port 4000, and our actual endpoint is /employees. Then we're going to use the Axios library. We're going to invoke its get method and provide the URL that we want to hit. So this is an asynchronous operation. So it will return a promise object. That promise object has a then method. And to that method, I'm going to provide a function. that function will receive the response as the first parameter. And then as we know, that is a complex object that doesn't just include the data from our backend, but also additional metadata like the status code and headers and things like that. So to actually get the array of employees, or to be less specific, to get the response from the endpoint, the actual data, we want to access the data property on that object. And that, in this case, will represent our actual array of employees. Cool. So at this juncture, we have our array of employees. So in order to trigger our component to re-render, we of course have to call setState. So right here, I'm going to do this.setState, and I need to specify with an object which properties I want to update. Well, of course, I want to update the employees property of state, and I can use ES6 syntax here to make this property reference this value, this employees array. So when this happens, when the React component receives that array of 5 employees and saves it to a new state, that will trigger a re-render, at which point this employees state, this array, will be 5 employees. And when we re-render, then we're going to filter them. And the first batch is going to be all 5 of them because the user has not entered a search term. And then we're going to get back to our original implementation where we're going to see all 5 cards. So when I save this, you can see they all pop up. And this is big progress because even though our app looks exactly the same, we are now making an actual request to our backend. We are making a request to our mock server, to our JSON server. I can, in fact, show you this by opening up my developer tools and going to the network tab. And I will refresh the page here. And you can see somewhere here, we're going to find that request right here. So you can see we are hitting employees, and right here, we can see it is at localhost 4,000 employees. So we are making a request to our own computer, but in a real world production app, this would be some other website or URL on the internet, our API, where we want to get data from. And you could see here in the response that that data is coming in as expected. Here in our preview, perhaps it's even more easier to play around with it. So you can see we're getting an array of those 5 objects, and we are parsing that information and then simply saving it to our state, which forces a re-render. So now we kind of have this beautiful state where our component starts out empty, and then once the backend responds, then we populate the actual employees, and then afterwards the rest of our functionality remains the same. So once again, if I filter for MI, there we go, or HU, there we go. Everything appears to be working. The only difference is we've now populated our data by making a request to a backend, which is an asynchronous action that doesn't quite belong in the render part of the process. Our component's primary responsibility is to render some JSX, some UI. So lifecycle methods like componentDidMount is how we solve the problem of side effects. A side effect is just something the component has to do on the side, right? Separate from the render. It's an additional operation. And this is a perfect example. Our component wants to render itself, but we need to get some data and then use that data to populate the component. And that's why lifecycle methods like componentDidMount exist in the React class component ecosystem, so we can accomplish operations like this. All right, that's all there's to cover in this lesson, so I will see you in the next one.